What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and in this video we're going to be talking Fauna. Now if you've never worked with Fauna before, this video is for you. I'm going to show you the basics of how to implement Fauna with a Next.js application. I'm talking how to create documents, update them, delete them, and even use indexes to make complex queries easy. Now this video is sponsored by Fauna, but there's a reason that we've decided to collaborate together. So I'm a big fan of Fauna, and the reason behind this is twofold. Firstly, they allow to use both GraphQL and their own SQL language to get all of your data or update your data or make any queries. So I like the flexibility of being able to use GraphQL when I feel like it, or SQL if you prefer. The second reason is one of the things I hated most about being in the Jamstack is connections to databases. If you're using a more traditional database, you have to sort of maintain database connections and make sure that you don't connect too many times, or you have to remember to close those connections too. Well, with Fauna, that doesn't exist. You're making transactional API calls to the database. So each time you make a call to the database, it's one transaction, and you don't have to worry about opening or closing or keeping things connected. It's all done via APIs. So I'm also going to be doing 2 more videos with Fauna over the next 2 months. Now, these videos are going to be driven by you, the people at home. So if there's something you want to learn about Fauna, let me know in the comments below and I'll make sure to include it in the video. Because what I want to do is take you through a journey of learning Fauna, and I really want to make sure I'm covering topics that you care about. So if you're ready to learn the basics of Fauna, let's start digging in and start looking at some code. So before we get started and we talk about how to set up Fauna and get that working with a project, I thought it would be a good idea to at least explain what we're doing. So this is a UI that is essentially a to-dos list that allows you to do a few things. First, it allows you to add a to-do. It allows you to complete a to-do. It allows you to delete a to-do. And it also has this completed section that allows you to see all of the completed tos that have been finished. So what we're going to do right now, none of this code actually works. So if I type something in here and hit add, it just refreshes the page. If I click this, nothing happens. And if I click delete, again, nothing happens. So right now it's a very bare bones UI. Now, we're not going to build this UI out. It's already pre-built for you, and you'll be able to find a link in the description to the GitHub that you can use as a template. So you just go to the GitHub, hit the template button, and then you'll be able to clone it from there. So now we've talked about that, let's jump into the Fauna UI and talk about how to set up a database once you've signed in and how to get the key that you need. So this is the FaunaDB dashboard when you have logged in to your account. Now you can see I already have a database here, and that's because I was testing and making sure everything worked exactly the way that we wanted. But we can create a new database here, and I can show you how it all works. So when you select create a new database, it's going to slide in this version and it's going to ask you what you would like as the name. So let's call this to-dos list, and let's select a region group. Now you have a few options here, and I'm going to select United States just because that's the one that's closest to me. You can select Europe or Classic, and depending on which one you select will be a very important piece that we need to talk about. So I'm going to select US, and it says this region requires that your driver is configured with a specific endpoint. So if you select Classic here, you won't have to put in a specific endpoint. It will just hit whatever it needs. So I'm going to select US, and we'll talk about how to change this setting. We're not going to use any demo data. We're going to create all of our data ourselves. So once you hit create, it's going to spin up a new database for you, and it's going to say, hey, create your first collection. And now you can think of a collection as a table. So if you've come from the world of SQL, you can think of it as a table. So when you select a new collection, it's going to ask you for the collection name. So we'll call this to-dos. And then we'll hit save. And it will say collections to do is created. Now at this point, you're inside the collection, and technically we could write a new document using JavaScript, or we could actually connect this to our project and use this to insert the collections. Now, we are going to come back to this at some point and create an index. And this index is a way for you to easily be able to browse and collect the data. So if you imagine you wanted to see all of the completed to-dos, we could write an index that gives you the option to see all the completed ones or the ones that aren't completed. So it makes it really easy to make requests without actually having to worry. So now that we have this set up and we have it installed, one thing we need to do is create a API key that we can use. So select this security button on the left-hand side and select new key, and then give it a role of server, and then give it an optional name. I'll just call this the to-do key, and hit save. And you'll see on the screen right here, there is a key. It's only displayed once. So make sure that you store this somewhere secure so that you can use it over and over again if you happen to be deploying this and you need the key again, or you delete your .env.local and you need it. So once you click off this screen and you have this key, you won't be able to see it again. You'll have to revoke the key and add a new one. So just keep that in mind. And that's all we need from the setup right now. So make sure you copy this and put it inside a .env local, and we'll talk about what that .env local should look like right now. So here we are in the .env local, and I've created a new environment variable here called FaunaDB secret key, and go ahead and after the equals, drop in your secret key, and then we'll be ready to start using FaunaDB. So now we have that, the next on our list will be to install the FaunaDB package that we need. So do yarn add FaunaDB, and that will install the FaunaDB package that we need to make this all work. So now we have that, and it's installed. We're going to be creating a bunch of APIs here, and each API is going to do a specific thing. So we're going to have one API request that does the adds, one that does the complete, one that does the delete, one that does the get all of the to-dos, and then one more that does the get completed to-dos. So it gets all the ones that have already been completed. So under the API, we can go ahead and delete this hello.js. We won't be needing this. And then under this API, we're going to create a folder for each one. And we can do add.todo, and then another one, and call that complete-to-do, and another one, delete to-do, and we need the gets here, so you can do get completed, and finally get to-dos. So now we have all of these. Each one of these is going to have an index.js file. And I find this option here easier to use in general. So this is a preference thing, but I like to segregate my API points by folder and then create an index.js inside of them. So we're going to start with the add to-dos. And this is going to give us the ability to create a document inside of a collection. Now, this document is going to take in the title, a note, created at, updated at, and if it's completed. Now, one thing to note is the way that the language works with the FQL is it's very similar to JavaScript functions as we're writing this. Because we're using the JavaScript driver, it's very similar to using JavaScript functions to create what we want. So to use FaunaDB, we need to import that at the bottom. So we can do FaunaDB equals require FaunaDB. And then we need to create the query. So we can do const q. And I'm just using q as an example. So let's actually call it query and say FaunaDB.query. Now that gives us the ability to make queries on behalf of FaunaDB. Then we need to tell it that we need to create a client that will allow us to actually make the queries. So we do const client is equal to new Fauna db.client, and then inside of our client is where we're going to do two things. Now, if you selected classic as your option for where you wanted this done, your options were US, Europe, or classic. Now, if you did classic, you won't need this. You only need one part of it. But if you selected one, you're going to need to make sure you use the right domain. So, because I selected US, we're going to need this secret, which, remember, comes from our environmentals here. So we can do process.env fauna db _secret_key. Now, because I selected US, we actually need to provide a domain because this key is segmented to that domain. So, like, if you don't tell it that, hey, this is on a US domain, what will happen is it will give you an unauthorized request because it's trying to use just the classic routing and it won't work. So we're going to do db.us.fauna.com. And that will give us the ability to use the US version. Then we're going to make the API part, which is modules exports equals async res for request and response. And inside of here is where we're going to make our request. Now, inside of our to-do components here, we have one called Add To. And as you can see here, we're using two inputs. One is for the title and one is for the note. So we know that we're going to need to include both the title and the note in our request down to FaunaDB because those are user inputs. So just like any other kind of API request, we can actually pull these out from the request body. So we can do title, comma notes, and this will destructure these values for us. And we can say equals request.body.data. Then we can do our try and catch here. So we can do try. And this is where we're going to actually make a request to Fauna. So we can say const dbs equals await client query. So we're saying, hey, we're going to make a client query here. And this client query is going to say query, which is our FaunaDB query here. We're going to make a query and say query.create. So we're saying, hey, we're going to make a create here. And we need to tell it which collection. So we're going to say query.collection. And then we give it our collection name here. So if you've forgotten what your collection is, you can go back to the FaunaDB dashboard and say, if you go to this section, so DB overview, you'll see to-do list and then to-dos. So it's to-do list / to-dos. So the collection name is to-dos. So we can drop that in there now. To-dos. And then we can put a comma here in between our two parentheses. And then we can open up our object here. And this is the part that we're actually going to pass in data to our query. So we can say data, comma. We can say data, colon, and then another object. And then we can give it all the pieces that we know. So we want to give it a title. And that title is going to come from this. So we can do title, colon, title. And then we're going to give it a note. So we can say note is equal to note. And then we're going to give it two things here, the created at and updated at. And we can use just date now to give it a date timestamp. So we can say at and say date.now. And that will give us it in Unix timestamps that we can convert later as needed. And so updated at will also be date now because technically we have created and updated it at the same time. And then we're going to give it a Boolean here of completed. And we can say false. So we're saying when we make this DB request here, we're going to query and use the create function for the collection to-dos and then say this is the data that we want to be included with our request. Then if it's successful, we'll do a response. If it's not successful, then we'll do something else. So underneath this request here, we can say res status is going to be 200, and we'll do JSON, and we can put DBs here, and we'll just return everything that gets responded. And then we can do our catch statement here. So we can say catch e console.log e, so that we know that there's an error message. And then we can return a status of 500. And inside of our JSON here, we can write error message and then e.message. And that will give us the error message that's responded from our Fauna creation. So let's format this really quickly and hit save. And now we have a nicely formatted piece of code. So let's talk it through one more time before we actually attempt to use this. So what we're saying here is we want to create a connection to FaunaDB query and create this client that will allow us to make the queries on our behalf. Then in our standard Next.js API response and request, we're going to destructure the request body.data, which is going to hold both the title and the note that the user wants to use as a to-do. We're going to then attempt to try and connect to our database and make a query based upon a creation using the collection's to-dos with the data, title, note that it was created at, what time it was updated at, and when it was, if it was or is completed. And obviously we want to set that to false because they just created this as an option. Then we're going to respond back with the database response, which should be everything inside of our DBs. And then we're going to catch E. If there's anything, we're going to log it out and write an error message. So we can hit save here. This is ready to be used. So now we need to update this add to-dos to actually do something. So the way that adds to do is going to work is we're going to use useState, and then we're going to put both the title and the note in a useState, and then use that to create our requests. So we can import useState, and that's going to come from React. And then inside of our function here for add to-dos, before our return statement, we're going to do title set title, and that's going to be useState, and we'll set that to an empty string. Then we can copy and paste this and set this to note and set note, because those are two pieces that we need for our API requests. Then we can also set a const here of loading and then set loading, because we want the button that we have down here to have a little spinner or something to show that we're actually doing something at the database level. And now we are ready to essentially use this to do some sort of work. So right now, these input fields don't have any way to handle the value or the on change as we go. So we need to make some edits there as well. But first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually launch this so we can see it side by side and we can understand both the UI and the code together. So we're working in this section here. We're looking at this add to-dos, and we want these to-dos to have the values for both the title and the note of these use states so that we can track as the user inputs. So we can do a value here and say value equals title, and that will give you the ability to track this value. So we can say value equals note. So now we have those. One thing we need to do is actually handle the on change. So to handle the on change, we're just going to write two quick consts up here. We're going to say const handle title change. We're going to set it equal to event and then we're going to just say set title equal to the event target value. And that will essentially just say, hey, every time someone updates this title, set the title to that value. So now we can take this handle title change and put it as the value here. We can say on change equal to handle title change, and that will handle title changes. Then we can just copy this and paste it here and say handle note change, and then we'll just set note equal to the same thing, and then we can set the value here on change equal to handle note change. Now if we hit save here, what we'll find is we can enter something in and we can delete them out, but this button itself is where the magic happens. But we need to disable this button if we don't want someone to send FaunaDB to empty strings, right? So to combat that, we can do two things. We can set this to disabled when the title is equal to an empty string, or the note is also equal to empty string, and that'll do for now. So you'll see it is immediately disabled. If I type in 1, it's still disabled. If I type in 2, it's not. So now we have that disabled. We can add one more attribute here called is loading, and we can set it to that state of loading and hit save. So now we kind of have everything ready to go. What we need to do now is actually handle what happens when a user clicks the button. So the way this is going to work is we're going to make a post request to our API that we created. So this API right here. So to do that, we're going to use fetch. Now, if you've not used fetch before, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to explain it as we go along. But let's hide this sidebar and talk about how fetch works. So fetch requires a request option of method post. It needs to know what kind of content we're sending, and then the body data. So we can actually handle this above our state management here. We can say const request options and set it equal to an object. And then we can say method post. Then we can set the headers, and we'll say the headers are an object, and the content type is going to be equal to application/JSON. So we're telling it we're going to send JSON to it. Then we need to send the body. So we can give another one here called body, and we can say JSON dot stringify. So stringify. And inside of that, we're going to have data. And then inside of that, we're going to have title. And we're going to set that to title. So we're setting an object of the name title to the value of this title. Then obviously we need notes, and then we'll set that to note. And then we can hit save here. And now we have some request options. Now we have the request options. We just need to handle the onSubmit. So underneath our handle change here, we can write const onSubmit is equal to an async function. And the first thing we need to do is set the loading equal to true. Now that will stop a user from multiple requests to our FaunaDB. We don't want that. We want them to hit this button and then wait until we're done. Then we need to prevent the default, because we're using a form here. We want to prevent the default functionality. So we just say e.preventDefault. Then to use API requests, we can use await fetch. And what's great about Next.js is that you don't need to give it the full URL. You just need to give it a slash, then say API/add-to-do. Now you'll notice that that matches, if we look at our Explorer again, that matches the API name here. But we don't need to add the index.js. Next.js is smart enough to say, hey, this index.js is clearly what we want. So now we've got that, we can say, hey, please try this out. But we also want to send it down all of these request options. So we say request options, and then we can just do .then. And the .then here is going to just set the note and the title and loading back to default. So we can just say set note, and let me just word wrap this so it comes down here. We can say set note equal to empty string, and then we want to set title to empty string, and we also want to set loading to false, so we can just say comma set loading to false. So now we have set loading to false. We can also do a .catch. So .catch, so if anything bad happens, we can say E, and then we'll just do console.log E, and we'll also do comma set loading to false and hit save. So let's just talk about this one more time before we actually use it. So what we're doing here is saying, hey, when they onsubmit, set the loading to true, prevent you from trying to refresh the page for us. Then we're going to make a call to our API point with our request options, which are here. We're going to tell it it's a method of post. Here are our headers, and here is the body. We're then going to, if it's successful, we're going to then set the note, the title, and loading back to false. And if not, we'll catch an error message. So to use this, all we need to do is add the onSubmit handler to our form. So we can just write words on submit equal to onSubmit and hit save. Now this is ready to test. So we can go to Add Todo here and type testing 1 2 3 exclamation point testing testing and hit Add Todo. Now we don't actually know what happened because one, when we click this, we expect it to be positioned down here so that we can see it. But we currently know that we're not actually getting that data from a database, and this is just the stock one that I've given to you. So that's fine. But did it successfully do something, or did nothing happen at all? So let's go back to FaunaDB and check to see if that's true. So here we go. Test 1 2 3 created at this time, updated at this time, and completed equals false. So that really does work the way we intended. But now we have this. If we try and query this data, it's going to be a bit of a pain. We're going to have to do a very long, complicated query to ask for the uncompleted to-dos to display right here. So that's the power of Fauna. We can now make an index here and say new index, select our to-do collection, give it a name. So let's give it a name of to-dos index. And the terms here, which are optional, are terms fields which document fields can be searched. Leaving it blank means that you can't specify a document to be searched on. So we want to be able to use data.completed. And that gives us the ability to say, I want either all of the completed or all of the non-completed to-dos. So if we hit save, now we have this like way to search documents. So if I set this to FQL, because ours is a Boolean, so we need to use the FQL option versus a string or a number. And if I type the word false in here and type search, you can see that immediately that one test to do that we created is returned. So now we can use this index to retrieve our to-dos for the bottom section right here. So let's go ahead and do that really quick, and then we can talk about how we set a completed one and how we can delete one. So we're now inside the Get To-Dos API, and we're going to make an API very similar to the one that we just made. So if we go here, to speed up a bit of time, we'll take the first top section and drop that in our query, and then close out our API request. So then we can do try, just as we did similarly, and then do const dbs equals await client query. So we're going to make another query using our client here. And then we're going to use query dot map. So we want to map over some data. Query dot paginate. So we want to paginate the query. And we want the query to dot match. So we're telling it we want to match on something. And then we're going to use our index. So query dot index. Then we give it the index name. So it's Todos index. And then we want to say comma false here. And remember, if you go back to FaunaDB really quick, and we look at this again, the Todos index has this option, right? Data completed is either false or it's true. So we're saying, hey, we want the false option here. So anything that is not complete, make sure it matches on that first. Then we can say that we have this query, and then we just need one more piece to this query. So after our map section, so here, in between that, we need to do ref, and then query dot get ref. And then we put a comma here, and now we have this query. This essentially says, hey, just get me all of the ones that are referenced in this query. Then we can say, that point, if we're successful, we should just return a status of 200.json, and then todos dbs.data. So return all the dbs data as todos. Then we can do our catch statement. So if something terrible happens, which, you know, sometimes it does, we can say response.status 500.json, and then we'll just do error.e.message. And that gives us the ability to request all kinds of to-dos that have not been completed based upon this false query. But what we can actually do is take this and copy it, and under our get completed, we can make a single line change and make this work as well. So in here, if we wanted all the completed ones, we can set this to true, and that will give us the ability to query both completed and uncompleted to-dos. So now that we have those two, what we can do is inside of this to-dos, we can start making requests to grab the ones that have not been completed yet. So we're going to use something called SWR, which is stale while revalidate, which is a Next.js or at least Jamstack specific stale while revalidate, and it's one of my ways I prefer to make client queries. So to add that, all you need to do is do yarn add SWR, and that will install the package that we need. So now that's installed, we need to import that at the top. So we can say import use SWR from SWR. Now this is going to be really good because what SWR does, if you've never used it before, it allows you to make requests and also get updated data. If someone, for example, was to tab off a screen and come back and look at our application, we would want them to be able to get the freshest data. So we would actually make a request on their behalf behind the scenes and update anything on the screen. So we're going to use something called fetcher. And fetcher is just the way that we're going to handle our requests, and we're going to return JSON from it. So the easiest way to do this is to do const fetcher equals ... args. So we're going to pass in some args. Then we're going to tell it to use fetch, and then ... args. So we're going to take in the arguments. Then we're going to make fetch use those arguments, and then then. So at the end, just respond back with rest.json. Then the way to use it is very similar to maybe Apollo client if you've used that before. We're going to have a data and an error. And we're going to say equals use SWR. So use SWR. Then we're going to pass in the API request. So API/get todos. and then comma fetcher. And at that point, now we actually have the ability to pass in some of the fields. So then we can do some error handling. So we can say if there's an error, or if there's no data. And if there's an error, we can say return div failed to load. And then if there's no data, we can just say loading. And we could put a spinner here or something else, but that's not really a requirement for this example. So now we have this. All we need to do is now handle the data in this section. So we can just do a map here and say data todos.map. And then inside of the map, we'll call it a single to do and an arrow, and say inside of here, for each one of those, we should return a to do. And inside of that to do should be the data. So we can do key equals, and then whatever key that we want. So I'm going to use to do dot timestamp or TS, and then to do equals to do. And that will be the data from our returned allotment here. So we're saying for each to do here, so we're going to pass that along. And then we can close this out and hit save. Now, what should happen now is if we go back to our local host and launch the application, what we should see now is what's coming back from the database once we've made the updates to the actual screen here. Because right now in our to-do, which handles each individual to-do, it's just going to have nothing. So we need to fill out the value, the ID, and then the title and the note. So we need to pass in the to-do. So we can say we're passing in the to-do for this to-do. The value here is actually going to be the ID from the database. Now the way to get that is to do to-do.ref, and that's returned in our requests. And then we can do @ref, so we want the ref.id. And that will give us the value. And we can also set the ID to that because they are obviously individualized as it is an ID. We're not going to do this yet. So let's do the title, which the title will just be to-do.data. To-do.data.title. And then for the note, it will be very similar. It will be to-do.note, and hit save, and then we have this working. So let me just back up one more time because quite a bit happened there. So we are getting the to-dos here, and we're returning this as the to-dos, and we're returning the data from the database. Then in our to-dos, we're requesting that data and then saying if there is any data, please just return it, and we'll map over that data and we'll pass it along to our application. Then in the to-dos, we're saying give me the value, which is the reference ID number, so that we know which one it is for each value and ID. And then we want to display the title and the note to the user. So now we have all that. Let's launch our code, and I'll meet you back in localhost 3000, where you should now see new data. So here we are. Now we can actually see this. Testing 1, 2, 3, test. So let's add another one. This is great. Fauna really rocks. And click add to do. But it didn't actually update at the bottom. And I don't see any changes. But if I tab out and tab back in, now the data's there. Not ideal, but we can fix that by using something called useMutate, which we'll get into right now. So we're back inside our add to do here, and what we can actually do is make a request to mutate through SWR. So we can say import here and say import mutate from SWR, and hit save. And then we can use this mutate. And what this mutate does is essentially say, hey, anybody that's using this API, tell them that they have to revalidate our data right now. So don't wait 30 seconds. Don't wait until they tab off. I need this data right this second. So what we can just quickly do is say inside this then, before we set anything to blank or loading, we can just say mutate and then give it the API. So we just say API / get Todos. Make sure we put a slash in the beginning and hit save. And then we can just put the comma at the end, save it again, and then go back to our local host. And now what should happen is now you can see it's instant. So we can say FE, hello, and hit add, and immediately it's there. So now we actually have something that works really well. So now we only have two things to really do with this section, and then we just need to finish completing our completeds. So let's work on doing our completed. So to speed up some of the time, I've just created the same kind of API request. Now we could extract this all out and make this its own API helper, but for this course, I want to make sure you understand that this is required for every request. So now we need to essentially take something from our to-do here and say, when somebody clicks the button, we want it to do something, right? So we know that if we send this down, we should use the ID to handle the changes to complete the to-do, because the ID, which is generated by Fauna, is individualized to each item. Because heaven forbid someone has the same, to-do title or to-do name, we don't want to update to by accident. So we know that's what we're going to get. So let's take the ID and say request body.data.id. So similar to our other one, we're going to take in something from our request body, which is named ID, and use that to make a request. Then we can say try. And inside of our try statement, we're going to connect to the DB again. So const dbs awaits client.query and say we're going to do an update statement this time. So the way the update statement works is query.update, and then we need to give it a reference. And the reference we're going to use is the collection plus the ID that's generated by Fauna. So you can do query.update, query.ref, and then inside of that we need query collection, and then put in Todos, because that's our collection name. And then we just need comma ID. So we're telling it, hey, this has to completely match before we can do anything else. So don't try and update any other value except from the one that matches this ID in this collection. Then we can say, what data do we want? So inside an object, we can write the word data, and we can just say completed true, and that will set the completed variable from false to true. And then we can do updated at and set it to date.now. And then that query is complete, and we can say if there's for some reason an error message, we can do catch, and we'll set this to E. And then inside of here, console.log, similar to all our other ones, res.status 500.json error e.message, and then we just need our response from this, right? So we can just do res.status 200.json, and then we can just use whatever is returned from DBS. Now we hit save. Let's talk about this one more time so that we fully understand it before we implement it. What we're saying is hey, connect to the database and make a query of the type update. Then we need a reference to do the update for. So we're saying find the reference that has the collection of to-dos with the ID that's coming from our request. If you find it, go ahead and set the data equal to true for completed and updated to right this second. Then, if that's successful, respond back, else respond back with a 500. So now we have that, we can just go to our to-do here and change this onChange value to whatever we need it to be. So all we need the onChange to do is complete the to-do. So we can do that by just taking our request options here, as we did with our first post. So if you remember in our add to-dos, we had this request options. So we can copy this because it's exactly the same idea and say, we want to make this request option, but the data here is going to be data ID and then the same as our ref here. So we can pull this ref and just drop it in here. So now we have the request options. All we have to do is make a request to the API. So we can say const complete to do equal to an async e, and then do prevent default to stop it from trying to do anything funky, and then say await fetch, and then to the API, which is /API/complete to do, and send down our request options, comma request options. So that will send down this section here, and then we can do .then. And now that we know about mutate, we can actually use mutate to handle them updating the screen for us when it's complete. So we can just say, we need mutate from SWR, take the mutate, then take the then here and say, we need you to do something. So why don't you go ahead, mutate, and then /API/get to-dos. And make sure we spell API right here as well. And then we can just handle the catch too. So we can just say catch e console log e and hit save. And now we have this complete to do that's going to do a fetch to this API/complete to do. Then if it's successful, we'll mutate by saying, hey, go and revalidate that data right now. It will say, okay, I'll make a partial request. Oh yeah, I see that something's changed. Let me update the screen for you. And then we'll catch any mistakes if we've made them. Then all we have to do is change the onChange from console.log to complete to do and hit save. So now we should be able to go back to our local host and test this really quickly. So let's open up localhost here and click this button. And you can see it gone away. And if we click this button, it's gone away. If we click this button, it goes away. So that's all working as expected. So now all we have left is the delete functionality. And the delete functionality works similarly in the sense to this, but with some slight variation. So let's go back to our code and make those changes. We're in our to-do index.js, and I've just copied the top section to save time for us. And we're going to do const ID is equal to request body dot value dot ID. So we're going to get the value from our request body. And then we're going to do a try again and say try dbs equals awaits client dot query. So hey, make a query again for us, client. We'd like to make a query dot delete. So we're saying, hey, go ahead and delete that query.ref. So on the reference of query.collection. So on the collection of, we'll say to-dos. And then finally, after the to-dos, we'll do a comma here and say ID. And we can hit save and say catch. And let's just write out our catch statement. It's the same as every other one. So let's just copy one here and say we want this catch. And then if we hit save so that we can kind of talk about this before we do the response, we're just saying, hey, go ahead and make a query again, But this time, let's delete whatever we're sending to you. Let's make sure that the query matches this collection and the ID that I'm providing. If so, go ahead and delete it. Else, if there's an error, catch it. And then if there is a successful, we can do status 200.json dbs and hit save. So now we have this delete functionality, and it looks fairly similar to other ones you've done. We're just using the delete query and then looking for the reference. We can now use this in our delete to do. So inside of our delete to do, which is in our to do section here, this is where we're going to handle the deletion. So this value is passed down from props. So if you look at this to do here, you'll notice that this value for our checkbox is actually this value here, which is the reference number. So we're using the same reference here, and that's passed through our data. And if you want to check that out, you can look inside our checkbox here, and you can see the same values here are used throughout. So now we have that value. We can take that and use it as part of our request. So the first thing we need to do is create request options. So request options is equal to method, and we'll set that to post. Then we need to set the headers, and the headers will be the same as before. So we can just say headers, content dash type, application slash JSON, comma body, and then set the body to JSON dot stringify. And then inside of our stringify, we're going to have a value here. And this value is the value that we're passing along. Then we can say const delete to do. So please delete this to do. That will be an asynchronous function. And we'll pass in e to handle prevent default. And say e.prevent default. Don't do anything funky. Then we can do await fetch. Then API slash delete to do, comma request options, and then dot then. And the dot then, as before, will do something. So for now, we'll just do an arrow. And what we can do is actually mutate it again. So we can do import mutate from SWR. Take the mutate and say, hey, you know what? If it's good, mutate it. So we'll just say API slash get dash to dos. Otherwise, dot catch e. And then we'll say e. And then console.log e. And then hit save. So let's just talk about this one more time before we actually put it in here. We're saying, hey, we're going to send down this value that is our to-dos value. Then we're going to make this API request to delete to-dos. And this delete to-dos is going to take that ID and delete it based upon this reference here. So we're going to say, hey, in this query, as long as this ID matches, go ahead and delete it. Then, if that's successful, we'll mutate them. Otherwise, let's log out an error message. And then all you have to do is update this click functionality and say to do. And hit save. Now, if we go back to our application and test it, let's see what happens. Okay, so here we are back in our application. And if we click the delete button, it should just be removed. And there we go. So we successfully now deleted this. Now, the only screen left to update with some sort of fauna is this things you have done. And we already did the index for that. So the API is ready to go. We just need to update this page. So let's go and check that out. So here we are in the completed to-do section. And what's great about this is that we already wrote most of this code in our previous one. So we can do import use SWR from SWR. And then if you go back to your to-dos, we can take almost all of this and use it as we need. So we can copy this code here and drop this in and change the get to dos to get
completed. And that's our code right here that just is looking for the same index except from when it is set to true. So we can hit save here, and then all we have to do is take our data. So this is the section we need to update now that we're fetching this data. So inside of here, we can do a map. So we can do data.todos. And this is just a safety check to make sure, optional chaining, to make sure that if there's no data, we don't display anything. And we can say to do. So data todos map to a to do. And then inside of here, we'll do our return. So inside of here is where we're going to return everything. So we can cut this and drop it in here. And this will be where we do our work. So we have a field here called key. So we can just do todo.ts for timestamp. And that will handle our key. Then we can do todo.data.title because that's our title field. This is our note field, so we can just do note. And then finally, this is the date field, which is a bit more complicated because currently we have a Unix timestamp, and we don't want that. We want an actual date. So we can just do new date todo.data.updated at, so the updated time, to locale date string, and close that out and hit save. And at this point, this should all work, and we should be able to see our completed to-dos. So let's go back into our localhost and make sure that works. And here we go. Now we have data that is being displayed. We have the completed date, we have the notes and the titles for each one. So now we have a fully functioning website. So we can add another to-do here. So a new to-do. Awesome. Click add, and then that gets added here. We can add another one, another to-do. Cool. Add, and then we can mark this one as completed, and we could delete this one, go to our completed, and then this gets added with our new to-do. So everything is working as expected. So I really hope you enjoyed this FaunaDB basics crash course. It gave you everything that you could possibly need to use Fauna with SQL from a Next.js standpoint. Now, before I finish this video, I want to make something clear. This was clearly sponsored by Fauna, but we have free reign. So I'm going to be doing 2 more videos with them, and I am allowed to cover any topics that you could possibly want. So if you've played around with Fauna, but you want to do some sort of complex queries, or you want to see the GraphQL version, or you want to know how to migrate data from one database provider to FaunaDB, we can do all those things. If you want to learn how to secure an API using Auth0, we could totally do that too. I'm open to options, and I really hope that you'll leave a comment below and let me know what you want to see, because I want to make videos that you want to see, and so does Fauna. So until next time, see ya!